Casca Origins, Berserk's most tragic character, and the only reason Guts is still sane. Kinda. Explore. Since this is most likely going to be our last video on this beautiful and terrifying masterpiece of a manga, at least until Berserk returns, what better way to end things than with the person who represents the heart and soul of Kentaro Miura's creation. When Casca was introduced to the story, we had an idea of where her character's journey was headed, but what we thought and what actually happened are heaven and hell in comparison. Our protagonist's love interest went through a war even before she met him during the Golden Age arc, and every day since then has been a constant battle for her anyway. But the one thing Casca could always fall back on was her unrequited admiration for her mercenary band's leader. And when that was taken away from her in such a horrifying manner during the eclipse, it didn't surprise us to find out her mind was broken. As Elaine, she traveled mindlessly with Guts as the latter tried to restore her to her former self. But even when that happened, Casca couldn't catch a break. She is the most tragic character in all of Berserk, and the worst part is, this isn't new for her. Casca has been used and abused ever since she was a little girl, and we're going to talk about why that is so important to Berserk's ending. So without further ado, this is Casca's Origins, Explored. Before we get into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. The only woman in Berserk's story to not suffer tragedy immediately upon debut, at least up until that point. Up until the midpoint of the Golden Age arc, the women of Berserk had been given the typical dystopian fiction treatment. They were viewed by the men of this world as objects, and even little girls were not spared the despair that permeated every panel in those early days of the Black Swordsman arc. Things didn't get any better when we pivoted to the Golden Age, as we find out that Guts himself was a survivor of a harrowing incident of child abuse, and as we saw him grow up on the path of the mercenary, we came to think that perhaps nihilism is just going to be the way of this dark, dark world. And then we were introduced to Casca, and it was as if all our assumptions about where things were going to go were cut into ribbons by the big sis of the Band of the Falcon. After slaying Bezuso and collecting the bounty on his head, Guts was roaming through the countryside looking for the next battlefield to wager his sword upon. Unbeknownst to him, he was being observed by the comrades of the very man who'd gotten him 6 months worth of wages in a single day of work. A guy called Corcus, determined to make his name in the world and get a bit of shiny loot as well, rounds up a few of his friends and asks the leader of the band for permission to attack Guts. That leader, Griffith, tells Corcus to do as he pleases, and the mercenary is excited, but then he hears a familiar snigger and we get our first proper look at Casca. When Miura-sensei was asked about how he created her character, he said that he based it on his idea of the ideal woman at the time he was fleshing out all the Golden Age stuff. And what exactly was his idea of an ideal woman? Well, to quote the legend himself, he wanted Casca to be a brown female warrior who is strong but still feminine. And that latter phrase is perhaps the best way to describe the big sis of the Band of the Falcon. As Corcus was rubbing his hands at the prospect of all this money he was about to make, Casca shattered his assumptions by telling him he wasn't up to killing Guts. Corcus reverted to his usual self-aggrandizing ways, but the sole female warrior in the Band of the Falcon simply told him he would die if he tried, and turns out she was correct. Guts immediately cuts down 2 of his attackers upon being ambushed and halts Corcus dead in his tracks. The rest of the Band of the Falcon gathered around to watch their cocky comrade getting cold feet, and Casca let out a knowing cackle. But to her dismay, she was going to have to go clean up someone else's mess as always. That's because Griffith told Casca to deal with it, and before she could protest, shut her up with a look that said, "You know better than to disobey my orders." The female warrior donned her helm and set out to do her duty, which is something she made very clear to Corcus after saving his butt from danger. After dumping the crossbow she used to get Guts' attention, Casca drew her sword and fought him from horseback, and we learn that Miura-sensei kinda lied to us when he was talking about his ideal woman. Because Casca isn't just strong, she is exceptionally skilled as a fighter as well. This is evident by the way she handles herself against Guts. Casca not only meets his usual insta-kill sword swing with a charge of her own, she actually manages to engage Guts in an extended confrontation, something we'd we'd only seen him do against apostles at this point in the story. The fact that Guts didn't even realize he was fighting a woman until he accidentally knocked Casca's helm off her head is a testament to her strength, and the fact that she chooses to lean into the attack instead of panicking after losing her gear shows you just how confident she was in her own abilities. We are told that the only person who can defeat Casca in the entire band of the Falcon is Griffith, which is remarkable because even at this point in the story, the Falcon's numbers easily reached up to 500 men, and 499 of them were no match as a swordsman for Casca. But it became clear rather quickly that she herself was no match for Guts, because by continuing the attack on foot, Casca had clearly lost her reach advantage. And when you're going up against someone as powerful as the future Black Swordsman in the prime of his youth, you'll see your death coming once he has you on your back. That's exactly what happened to Casca, who thought she was dead when Guts made her hit the ground with his sheer size and strength. But before she was bisected in half, the apple of her eye saved her life once again. Griffith threw a spear between Guts and Casca and took over the duel for his second in command. And from the sheer delight Miura depicts on Casca's face, you could tell she was totally in love with him. She warned Griffith about Guts' insane strength before the two swordsmen engaged one another, and was all smiles and praises afterwards because Griffith defeated Guts with literally 2 sword swings and a single pinpoint strike. She chastised Corcus for praising their leader after stirring up trouble in the first place, and stood between Guts and Griffith as if on instinct when the former started rising after sustaining a fatal injury. Casca was forced to spend 2 days sleeping with Guts because his body had gone terrifyingly cold after losing all that blood, and because, according to Griffith, warming a man is a woman's duty. In hindsight, this should have been our first hint that this guy wasn't as great as we were being told he is, but the fact that Casca did it anyway tells you just how dedicated she was to serving Griffith. And to top it off, she managed to accomplish something with Guts that no one else had or has since then. She made him feel comfortable despite his many horrific life experiences. In his early years, Guts suffered from intense PTSD due to all the abuse he faced growing up in a mercenary band. Those flashbacks were running through his mind in the form of a fever dream, and if he'd found anyone else hugging him like that, all naked and stuff, he'd have probably split them in half without thinking twice. But with Casca, all he really noticed were her dark eyes. When he woke up, Casca punched Guts in his wounds real hard because she was clearly jealous of him. A guy called Judo told Guts not to mind the attack because Casca gave up on being a woman a long time ago, but it seemed rather apparent that it was because she was a woman that she disliked Guts. Casca was highly disturbed by the fact that Griffith, the sole object of her desire, wanted Guts more than anyone else he'd gotten into the band of the Falcon so far. She was shocked, actually, that Griffith would go out of his way and even duel Guts in order to recruit him simply because he had never done something like that before, ever. Griffith had never openly strived for the services of another person, and that is what made Casca resent Guts in those early days. She would keep him safe from the more treacherous elements of the Band of the Falcon, but she would make it very clear that she was just following orders. Casca wanted Guts just as dead as Corcus did, but she could never disobey Griffith. As his second in command, she was the only person besides him who could keep the Falcons in line, and, more than that, she was actually puzzled as to why Griffith would trust Guts so implicitly. The White Falcon gives the future Black Swordsman the task of bringing up the rearguard in his first fight as a Falcon, and Casca is the only one who understands how important that duty is out of all of her comrades. As the prequel section of the Golden Age arc comes to an end, we see her clutching her sword and staring at Guts intently. Little does she know how important the man she always picks a fight with is going to be in her life. A misplaced rivalry, a reason to worship, and yearning hearts in conflict. Casca's origins and relationships with Guts and Griffith. Even after spending 3 years as comrades, the relationship dynamic between Casca and Guts does not change. In the battle that ensures Griffith's rise to the position of Viscount, Guts ends up going off-plan, and yet again throws himself into the line of fire, endangering his comrades. Immediately after the battle, Casca takes Guts aside and chews into him for his recklessness. We'll be the first ones to admit she went a bit too far in calling him a mad dog, but we get why she said it. After all, Guts had replaced her as Griffith's favorite, and Casca wasn't immune to jealousy. She was able to keep it hidden most of the time under a guise of authority and stoicism, but everyone, including Corcus, could see it plain as day. She distracts herself by thinking about what Griffith's inclusion in peerage means for them as mercenaries, and resolves to keep the band in line for him. but she cannot help the way she feels. When the Band of the Falcon goes up against Nosferatu Zod in his released form no less, Casca is just as worried as everyone else for Guts' safety. That bleeds over to Griffith as well, because the White Falcon decides he was going to save his best soldier personally. Casca's first reaction is to scream after Griffith because she, like everyone else, couldn't believe what he was doing. But her second reaction was one of pure dejection, because this just proved Corcus and everyone else was right. Guts was Griffith's favored falcon. Even though two of her comrades were being cut down by a monster from legend right in front of her, Casca only worried about Griffith. She only called out to him when Zod was about to strike both Guts and Griffith, and she was the first to his side as well. When Guts tried to inquire after an unconscious Griffith following Zod's abrupt departure, Casca slapped him and told him it was his fault that they were going through all this. The next time she met Guts, she punched him in the face for creating a kerfuffle with the royal guards, yet again not caring about decorum and discipline. She repeatedly questions why Griffith keeps a guy like Guts around, but the proof is in the pudding. In his 3 years with the Band of the Falcon, the Raider captain had taken them from untouchable to invincible. His fighting prowess was second only to Griffith's in the entire band, and as the White Falcon began taking time off from the field to focus on political matters, that gap kept getting smaller. Heck, he was even good at hunting with nobles to an extent, and was the first person to organize a search party when an attempt was made at Griffith's life. The reason why Casca can't accept Guts is in the look she gives Princess Charlotte during the royal hunt. That look of intense longing is what keeps Casca from going over into the caricature territory. See, while it is true that Casca is jealous, and that her jealousy is not secret among her comrades, none of them know the reasons behind it. And just when it feels like she's always going to be that typical annoyed female lead in the story, Miura-sensei switches gears on us, and makes us kind of feel like pricks for thinking Casca could ever be annoying. Following the royal hunt, the Band of the Falcon is unwinding at a tavern in Wyndham City one night, when Guts shows up very late to the party. Casca is annoyed with him as usual, because this time he decided to skip out on a joint training drill between his raiders and her own unit, and she fully intends to let him know what's on her mind. But all that changes when she notices his vacant expression. Guts simply asks her where Griffith was, and Casca can't help but notice the arrow wound in his arm. She follows him to Princess Charlotte's party, and keeps a dazed Guts from intruding on Griffith's moment with the princess. Casca actually patches up Guts' wound, which surprises both him and us, and gives him company as his world comes crumbling down around him. Casca is present when Griffith explains to Charlotte what his definition of a true friend was, and it doesn't seem to affect her as deeply as it affects Guts. The surprises keep rolling because for the first time in the story, she actually shows some empathy for our protagonist. She moves to comfort him, but he just walks away from the whole scene. And right after this, he shows us that he hasn't forgotten that while Casca is a great fighter, she is still a woman. During the penultimate battle against the Tudor forces in the 100-Year War, Casca realizes that she is suffering from a menstruation-based fever. She can't believe that something so unavoidable was happening right before Griffith ordered them to charge in, but she was committed to helping him realize his grand vision. She waved off Judo's concerns about her health and rode into battle, but it was evident from the first time we saw her engaging the enemy that she was totally off her game. Casca was panting from the effort of having to bring down one man, and her day was about to get a lot worse because she was cornered by the leader of Tudor's Blue Whale Armored Knights, the misogynistic troll Adon Calberwaltz. The Tudor commander taunted Casca for being a woman on the battlefield, and made some insinuations about her rise to her position that really ticked us off. But what frustrated us more was the fact that Casca's weakened state meant she couldn't defend herself like she normally would, and this probably made that thick-headed bastard think his viewpoint on women was valid. To be fair, Adon Calberwaltz's skills with a trident were not at all shabby. He was swinging that thing around like he was the second coming of Poseidon, and Casca quickly found herself backed up onto the edge of a cliff. The Blue Whale Knight slew a few of her men who tried to save her, and she thought this was the end of the road for her, when Guts showed up to engage Adon in battle. The Raider captain was in a black rage when he engaged the Blue Whale Knight, but even he could see something was wrong with Casca. After seemingly taking care of Adon with 2 swings of his sword, Guts goes to check on Casca, but she just faints and falls off the cliff. He leaps to grab hold of her, and the defeated Blue Whale Knight takes the opportunity to strike him with a crossbow bolt. Both of them go falling off the cliff and fall straight into a stream, but that was probably more damaging than lucky. This is because a storm started blowing through the battlefield at that moment, and had Guts not been Guts, both he and Casca would have drowned. He realizes why Casca was acting the way she was when he pulls her out of the stream with him, and to his credit, the man acts quickly to save her. Guts takes Casca into the hollow base of a tree and, seeing no other safe option, decides to warm her up with his own body heat. To his mind, this was just returning the favor from 3 years ago, but as he finishes undressing Casca, he realizes what caused her fever in the first place. Guts, who had been cursing her for being a woman on the battlefield a moment ago, immediately gains a newfound respect for Casca because he realizes how rough it must be simply being a woman in the first place. When she wakes up, Casca immediately attacks Guts because, number one, she was naked, and number two, it was Guts. But after she exhausts herself trying to land a hit on the raider captain, she breaks down in tears when he once again calls her inept as a warrior on account of her sex. Guts immediately apologizes because he didn't mean it the way it came off. He was talking about her menstruation cycle and all the troubles that came with it. But of course, these two were not on the same page just yet. That started to happen when Guts asked Casca why she joined a mercenary band as a woman, and she told him that it was all because of Griffith. Casca was born in a nameless village nestled within a mountain ravine. The lands were so barren that only oats grew on the soil, and yet her village would be taxed so heavily that going 3 days without food was a common occurrence. Because Casca's homeland was a border territory, it would often be raided and pillaged by fighting forces. The villagers would often hide away in the mountains as they watched their homes burn, and from a young age, Casca had come to accept such misery as her way of life. One day, when she was 12 years old, a passing nobleman noticed her and offered to take her on as a maid in his castle. Casca had 5 other siblings, and as the youngest daughter of the family, it pains us to say this, but she was expendable. Though he was reluctant, Casca's father agreed to give up his daughter to a random stranger for a bag of money that could probably keep the rest of his family alive, but he could not have foreseen what happened next. If you guys thought that the nobleman who offered Casca this job was too nice not to be sus, then you would be right. Because as soon as their carriage crossed the village border, he tried to assault Casca. The young woman did her best and fought her way out of the carriage, but it was all she could do as a child of 12. Casca had accepted the fact that she was going to get violated when the nobleman pinned her down. But just then, an angel arrived to offer her salvation. It was Griffith. The band of the Falcon happened to be passing by Casca's village, and Griffith saw what the nobleman was trying to push onto this young child. He sliced off his ear for his heinous attitude, but instead of going the whole way and punishing the guy himself, Griffith threw the sword at Casca's feet. He told her that the choice to take control over her life was her own, and whether it was instinct or fear or just sheer dumb luck that moved her hands, we don't know. But Casca used that sword to kill the nobleman in cold blood. She couldn't stop shaking because of the shock of it all, but Griffith calmed her down and wrapped her in a blanket to let her know she was okay. As he started leaving the scene, Casca sprang up and impulsively asked him to take her along with them. She reasoned that going back to her village alive would only get her killed, and she would rather go with this upstart warband than be a burden to her family. But the truth was far more sentimental. To Casca, Griffith was like her god. He saved her from a terrible fate, and then gave her the strength to make a life of her own. Casca thrived as a soldier, and she went from a life of suffering and silence to succeeding and making the loudest noise possible from a military standpoint. Despite being the only woman in a mercenary band, she became the second best swordsman only after its leader, and her idolized reverence for Griffith only increased with every victorious battle, until it came crashing down at the hands of Lord Genon. Casca knew the man's reputation, and when she saw his young male servants, she shivered, because she too had almost met the same fate as them not too long ago. Griffith's reassuring hand is what kept her heart from giving into despair, and for a while, she fought under Genon's employment with no objections like every other Falcon. But then, one night, she saw Griffith standing in Genon's balcony, right before their sponsor appeared. Genon directed the White Falcon into his bedroom, and the implication was something Casca picked up on as well, but she didn't want to believe it. Neither could Guts when she told him this. But her silence was much louder than any affirmation she could have provided him with. Casca saw Griffith taking a bath in a nearby river the next morning, and it was as if he was trying to cleanse himself of the filth of his actions the previous night. He asks Casca to join him, much like he did with Guts the morning after his first fight as a Falcon. But when Casca rejects him, Griffith asks her if he is dirty, as if he'd read her mind. Casca tries to play things off by saying that he must have been attending a war council or something, but Griffith coldly confirms her suspicions. When she asks him why he did it all in hysterics, he simply replies that it was for money. See, a while ago, a 10-year-old boy had died on the field of battle in Griffith's service. In a mercenary band, people are not expected to remember the names of their fallen comrades because that's just how harsh life is. But Griffith used to remember every man who fell under his banner. He brought the boy's toy knight as a farewell offering, and wondered out loud whether he could really be his hero, when his own dream might have gotten the lad killed. When Casca asked Griffith if it was that boy's memory which drove him into doing what he did, he once again rationalized it with cold logic. But this time, you could see his usual fortitude crack as he explained his reasons. It was true that appealing to a lecherous nobleman's tastes would get Griffith his war funds much more easily than fighting as a mercenary band. But that wasn't the only reason he slept with Gennon. Griffith told Casca he did not feel any guilt or remorse over the deaths of his comrades, because in his mind, they chose to fight for him out of their own volition. But the fact that he kept circling back to feeling unclean for living on as they kept dying, and the fact that he was literally clawing his own flesh apart, gave away his human disgust with the path he had chosen. Casca saw this, and ran to give him a hug, begging him to stop, but the Griffith who reassured her once again was the same one who puts on a veneer of confidence for everyone else. Casca knows that the burden of trying to become a ruler as a commoner is inhuman. She's perhaps the only one in the entire band of the Falcon who understands the scope of the White Falcon's ambition. She is so inspired by Griffith that she's willing to be by his side, as the sword that helps him cut his path towards achieving his dream. This is why she cannot stand the fact that Guts acts so selfishly all the time. As someone who worships Griffith as a person and a leader, Casca wants to ensure everything goes perfectly when it comes to fulfilling his dream. This is why she can't take it when Griffith acts so impulsively around Guts, because that's not the Griffith she knows. She breaks down crying in Guts' arms when the raider captain silences her. Apparently, they were being tracked by the enemy, and there was no time to waste. Guts gives Casca a tincture for her fever, and the two set out as soon as they determined it was safe enough to do so. Casca was still not in any shape to go out on a night trek, but Guts managed to taunt her into moving by reminding her that the enemy didn't care if she was a man or a woman. And yet, just as it looked like things were about to get better, they got worse, which is sort of a theme in Berserk. Guts and Casca were surrounded by Adon Cobberwaltz and his Blue Whale Knights in an ambush that involved over 100 Tudor men. Casca kept up with Guts' counterattack initially, as she took the head off of one of Adon's minions. But it became clear very soon that she couldn't keep it going for too long. Guts started playing both defense and offense as he chose to block the Morning Star being wielded by Samson Cobberwaltz instead of dodging it, because its trajectory would hit Casca. Guts told her that he would give her an opening to escape, and came through when he broke Samson's Morning Star and drove his sword through the enemy's head. But Casca couldn't believe it. She refused to be treated like a helpless maiden, and because she didn't escape, Guts had to protect her from a volley of arrows. She was extremely confused as to why he would do this, but he told her not to get the wrong idea. Guts thought that it wasn't right. Someone like Casca, who had a purpose in their lives, shouldn't throw it away this easily. Guts was made to swing the sword in battle like a mindless monster, but she was meant to be Griffith's sword, so he asked her to return to her sheath. For the first time since they met 3 years ago, Casca did not argue with Guts' logic, and instead set out to get reinforcements for him. She was ambushed by some of Adon's men on the way, and nearly got violated by them, but Guts' words gave her strength, and she rose to meet her attackers with steel. Casca was rescued by Judo in the nick of time, and while he was glad to see her safe and sound, all she could think about was Guts. She was terrified that they wouldn't make it on time, and the overjoyed look on her face when she realized Guts was alive was all we needed to confirm that she had, indeed, started falling for the newly christened 100-Man Slayer. Even Judo noticed that Casca's attitude towards Guts had softened considerably when he gave her some elf dust to help with their hero's wounds. And though she was still ecstatic that Griffith fought to send out a search party for them, her loyalties had been split down the middle. When Guts told her that he was planning to leave the Band of the Falcon after the current campaign was over, she felt extremely conflicted about it. Yes, they shared a sweet moment of victory at Doldry, and Guts even complimented Casca's pretty dress at the victory ball, but none of that meant his mind was going to be swayed. Casca's heart, on the other hand, had been sufficiently swayed, because in her desperation to get Guts to stay, she turns to Griffith for help, not aware of the demons she is about to unleash on the world. Casca thinks that once Griffith speaks with Guts, everything will be alright once again, but she should have known there was no coming back once the White Falcon bared his steel. Casca had personally seen Guts' growth over the last 3 years. Previously, she would have hedged her bets on Griffith in a fight, but now, all she could do was hope. Sadly, her prayers went unanswered, because all it took Guts was a single swing of his sword to defeat the enemy who had him dancing all over the place 3 years ago. The 100-man Slayer left the Band of the Falcon without even looking back once, but that didn't mean Casca didn't try. She tried to stop both Guts and Griffith from fighting, something that Judo remarked was unprecedented given her track record of obedience. And when she realized that she was doing all this because she wanted Guts to stay, that's when Casca knew she had fallen for him hook, line, and sinker. It's just too bad that one of the general rules for Berserk's world is that just when things seem like they're getting better, they get worse than you could have ever imagined. Wounds of the heart and wounds of the mind. How Casca became the axis around which Guts and Griffith's story revolves. The night of Guts' departure, Casca goes looking for Griffith at the Band of the Falcon's usual bar, but she can't find him. Instead, she goes to Guts' room and cradles his broken sword and helm in her arms. Little did she know that was the last night she was going to get to sleep in peace for about a year, because the next morning, everything came crumbling down. The Band of the Falcon was summoned for early morning drills, but suspiciously, they were told to leave most of their equipment behind. It became very evident that this was a setup for an ambush because soon enough, the Midland Army descended upon them like a pack of wolves hunting sheep. The Falcons were baffled as to why this was happening. They didn't know about Griffith's night of treachery with Princess Charlotte. As the men faltered in the face of the army, the only woman present on the field took command. Casca organized the remnants of the Band of the Falcon and spearheaded an escape, even as 5 arrows stuck out of her body, fleeing from the regular army for a full calendar year and never taking a single day off. It was because of her immediate and impeccable leadership that the people who survived that ambush and could still call themselves Falcons were still alive. Casca had learned a lot from Griffith. She knew that in order to keep her men strong, she had to appear strong herself, but the fatigue and emotional baggage of being branded as outlaws was getting to her. One night, as Judo encouraged her to get some rest and recuperation, Casca gave in to her despair and broke down, only to be forced to defend against an enemy raid being led by none other than Salat. Despite being sleep-deprived and exhausted into a near-death state, the leader of the Band of the Falcon managed to keep up with Salat for the most part. The young master of the Bakiraka clan eventually got the best of Casca and was about to get her to yield when the one man whom she had been missing the most all this time showed up to save her life yet again. Guts engaged Salat by himself as Casca organized the Band of the Falcon into defending against the Bakiraka prince's mercenaries. The 100-man Slayer's improved skill wowed everyone, Casca included, but there was something else eating at her as well. When she got the chance to speak with Guts alone, instead of talking to him, Casca attacked him with killing intent. Guts' aloofness about everything is what ticked her off the most. She kept swinging at him because, once again, she blamed him for everything that was happening. If Guts hadn't left, Griffith wouldn't have committed treason, and they would have all been together, but she snaps out of it when the former allows her to stab him. Guts questions Casca's logic, and asks her what he could have done that would have prevented all of this. And this is when she has a total breakdown. Casca admits to Guts that she never actually wanted to be Griffith's sword. She wanted to be his lover. Despite being a fighter and an ardent believer in the White Falcon's grand vision, she was a woman at the end of the day. Casca had known that in order to realize Griffith's dream, the easiest path was to seduce and marry Princess Charlotte, but she couldn't deny her own feelings for him anymore. And Guts leaving like that was the final nail in the coffin, because no matter how much she said she hated him, Casca had missed him as well. As she gave up on everything and started falling off of a cliff, again, she was held up by Guts, and this time, they finally made their relationship official with a kiss for the ages. There is a reason people call Berserk a love story, and that reason is two-part, because Wounds Part 1 and 2 are some of Miura's greatest accomplishments as a mangaka. We would recommend you go out of your way to read these 2 chapters or watch episode 21 of the 1997 anime. It's peak romance and a story quite literally filled with blood and guts. Guts and Casca open up to each other and give in to their feelings for each other. It's also kind of adorable how they were each other's first as well. But what really stands out is the way Miura cements their relationship while acknowledging their character development. Guts lets out a lot of childhood trauma here, and Casca does a lot of accepting, but in the end, the two find themselves hung up on the topic of where things go after they've rescued Griffith. Casca wants Guts to stay with the Falcons, but he has made his mind up. To fulfill his own dream, he couldn't stick around Griffith until he became his equal. This sent Casca into another temper tantrum, but the 100-man Slayer knew how to disarm her this time around. Guts proposed that Casca come with him after they're done rebuilding the Band of the Falcon, and though she calls his idea stupid, she ends up agreeing with it, sort of. With their relationship confirmed, insecurities dealt with, and their way ahead clearer than ever, Berserk's best couple sets out to see where life takes them. And unfortunately, the answer is hell. Oh, they managed to rescue Griffith all right. They get him out of the Tower of Rebirth, through a maze of Midland soldiers, over the corpses of Bakiraka assassins, and through the wall of excitement and enjoyment that was wild. But in doing so, Casca also realizes that her dream of rebuilding the Band of the Falcon had died a long time ago. Griffith was no longer the man he used to be, and we mean that from an objective point of view. He had been mangled and disfigured to the point where he could neither speak, walk, or hold a sword up with his hands. He was, for all intents and purposes, in a comatose state. Casca knew this instinctively, and cried tears of grief at the sight of her fallen leader, but to her mind, this also meant the end of her relationship with Guts. Though she had come to love him, she felt her duty to Griffith and the band was superior to her relationship, and besides, she didn't want him to stick around and miss out on realizing his own dream of standing beside Griffith as his equal someday. Yet when she entered the carriage to stay beside Griffith in his greatest hour of need, he tried to do what most other men tried to do to her when their blood was racing. Griffith, the man who once saved Casca from being violated, tried to force himself on her, and the shock of it rendered her immobile. All she could do was hug him out of pity for his current physical state, not knowing that this was only sending him further into the depths of despair. Once Griffith had been completely shattered due to Wild exposing his disfigured body to his comrades, he ran away from Guts and Casca, and ended up flying into a lake when his wagon was knocked off balance. During his time in the air, the White Falcon has a brief vision of a life he could have had with Casca as an invalid, and it really tells you what he thinks of her. Griffith, in his faux comatose state, lives with Casca, who serves as his partner and caretaker. They have a dog called Pippin, and a child whom they named Guts. To us, this shows his internal ranking for the Band of the Falcon members and their proximity to his real self. Even in his broken and fragile state, Griffith assumes the position of power over Casca and Guts, and this is when you realize that to him, even she was nothing but a tool for realizing his dream. When Griffith triggers the eclipse, the first person we were worried for wasn't Guts, it was Casca. That's because by this point we had met enough apostles to know their appetites, and sure enough, once their infernal nocturnal feasting began, Casca became the primary target of the gathered apostles' desires. Judo and Pippin died trying to save her, and Guts was fending off multiple apostles just to get to her, but she had already started rejecting the truth of what was unfolding around her. When Casca and the rest of the band heard Void speak about the Invocation of Doom and the requirements for its fulfillment, they didn't believe that their beloved leader would sacrifice them to literal demons just for his own sake. So when all of them were finally branded, they started rejecting the eclipse as a nightmare, and Casca was the first person to start doing it. When she was finally snatched up by apostles, they prepared to violate her before consuming her and finishing the cycle of sacrifices. But before they could, the purpose of the feast was fulfilled. All the blood and malice from the dead bodies and spirits of the fallen falcons surged into the palm of the god hand that had appeared within the interstice. And from the point of their confluence rose the fifth Demon King, a reincarnated Griffith, who was now called the Angel of Longing, Femto. By this point, only Guts and Casca remained from the original Band of the Falcon, and it was unclear what this newly born demonic entity would do as its first act, given a couple of sacrifices were left over. No one could have guessed that the man who used to be Griffith would violate the person who worshipped him most, even as a human being. Without saying a single word, Femto used his natural command over the apostles to have Casca delivered to him. He then proceeded to commit Berserk's most heinous and graphic act, and just to rub salt into the wound, he made Guts watch, knowing that he and Casca were in love. This is the culmination of all the red flags that we've been pointing out about Griffith's character throughout this video. Yes, Griffith gave Casca a reason to live and inspired her to become strong enough to fend for herself in a cruel world, but he also showed her time and again that he would do anything to achieve his dream, and he even told her that he did not regret the bloody path that he had to tread upon. Casca knew about Lord Gennon and Charlotte, and why Griffith was pursuing those people at the times that he was, but she chose to ignore it all anyway. Even when Griffith clearly forced himself onto her despite being a literally broken man, she let it slide because this was her hero. To Casca, Griffith had been more than a man, despite her human desire for him since day one, but to him, she was a constant constant reminder of his own power over people. The reason for Femto's violation of Casca was not a black sexual desire. It was to reassert his dominance over both his former subordinates who dared to fall in love with each other and slip out of his grasp. This is why once Femto is done with Casca, he discards her like a toy that doesn't interest him anymore. The branded couple is then saved by Skull Knight, who breaks into the interstice and carries them to Godot's mine. But saved is a strong word. That word can be applied to Guts, who recovered from the hellish experience rather normally, all things considered. But Casca's mind was broken. She had just witnessed and experienced her personal god not only stoop to the lowest depths of depravity, but also do the exact thing that he had once saved her from. And he did it to her. Not to mention all the horrific deaths she had witnessed in the lead up to that act. Due to the immense shock of it all, her mind had regressed to an infantile state, where the only things she could say were noises, and the only things she felt safe around were children and animals. Guts is shocked by this development. He can't bring himself to accept that the same Casca who once fought shoulder to shoulder with him was now reduced to such a shell of her former self. He tried to jerk her into normalcy, but it was pretty clear that that wasn't going to work. And in true Berserk fashion, things just got worse because Casca ran out of the cave that was keeping her safe and ended up being surrounded by dozens of malign spirits of the dead who all wanted to possess her. But something was odd. Instead of attacking Casca and trying to take over her flesh like they did with Guts, the evil spirits were only circling her. When Guts reached her, Skull Knight saw this and wondered why it was. Turns out, it was because she was pregnant. You see, when Casca and Guts sealed the deal, our main man didn't know the first thing about the concept of pulling out. So it must have been during that encounter that Casca ended up conceiving a fetus. However, because her womb was tainted with the essence of evil when Femto's seed entered inside it, that fetus was infected and matured way faster than it was supposed to. The reason the spirits weren't attacking Casca was because she was in labor, and the baby she gave birth to instantly grew into the size of a regular infant. But this demon child was cursed, and so Guts tries to kill it, despite knowing he was going to basically commit filicide. And this is when something happens that we think is very important to note. Casca moves to defend the child, as if working off a primal instinct, and Guts, being the real man that he is, lets the demon child fade into the night. But the fact that Casca still has the base level instinct that a mother has towards its child was an indication that she wasn't entirely gone. From this point onward, she herself becomes more of an accessory to the story than a character, and sadly, we mean that more seriously than you think. A pillar of flame and a girl named Elaine. How Casca's regression formed the basis for Guts' future journey. Once Guts decided that he was going to embark on a warpath against the Apostles in the God Hand, Casca was sort of forgotten about. The Black Swordsman decided to leave his lover behind because he knew that he wouldn't be able to take her into the darkness with him given her current state. But after defeating the Apostle Rosine, he changed his mind. Once again, Guts was too late in making a decision because when he returned to Godot's cottage, Casca had escaped, and he had to depart as soon as he got there. Turns out, she had managed to wander all the way to the city of St. Albion, which is where she was found by our best girl Luca and dubbed Elaine in order to protect her from the heretic hunt. This is where we must give you a very condensed version of events, because technically, we can make an entirely separate video on Elaine herself, but we've already told you this is our last Berserk video for a while. There are two reasons why Casca is very important to the events of the Conviction arc, and every arc that follows. Reason number one is keeping her safe and restoring her mind is the primary objective of the Black Swordsman party. The entire reason Guts allows other people to travel with him is because he thinks they'll help him take care of Casca better. This is proven correct when Farnace becomes Elaine's designated caretaker, and the rest of the group also ends up prioritizing her safety above all else. The second and more intriguing reason is that she seems to be tied into the plans that Causality has for the world of Berserk. When Guts goes on his hunt for Casca, he's approached by his demon child one night, who warns him that when a pillar of flame appears on holy ground, Casca will face grave danger. This is because there is apparently a prophecy concerning her arrival in St. Albion. The actions of the Skull Knight and the Egg of the Perfect World confirm this, because it is only after Guts and Casca arrive in St. Albion that the incarnation ceremony is properly triggered into motion. It is their brand of sacrifices that attract the blood flow of the dead, and the pillar of flame that the demon child warned Guts about turned out to be a witch-burning stake that Casca was nearly sacrificed upon. And her connection with Causality's grand plan goes even further, because towards the end of the incarnation ceremony itself, her dying demon child is swallowed by the dying egg of the perfect world. This child infuses into Femto's vessel of flesh and turns him into the Moonlight Boy every night there is a full moon in the sky. You'll get why this bit is important in just a moment, but having spoken of the 2 reasons that Casca is important to the overall story, let's also talk about her relationship dynamics for a bit, because the only one she had pre-conviction arc is one that has been heavily tainted. Guts initially had a lot of trouble adjusting to Casca's regressed state. She would act like a wild animal, and this one time she knocked over a bowl of soup onto her own dress. He made her strip because the soup was scalding hot and would have actually injured her, but seeing her naked body made him weak and he almost violated her. He stopped himself when he realized what he was doing and vowed to never think of such things again until he ended up actually doing it. See, though Casca was practically a child in thought and behavior post-eclipse, flashes of her previous self would burst through when she would find herself in adversarial positions. During the conviction arc, when Isidro was helping Casca and Nina escape from the cult of the Flame Goddess, he got the latter down, but realized too late that the former's weight was going to be an issue when lowering her from a rope. Without hesitation, Casca shook off her restraints and hopped her way safely down the cliff. It was a pretty steep slope, and one misstep would have meant certain death, but the Casca we know had seen death 1,000 times before and lived through worse than a downhill trek. She aced it, like the champ she is. It is the second time that got very disturbing because it involved not just some wanton thugs, but Guts himself. After the collapse of the Tower of Conviction and Griffith's incarnation into the physical world, Guts resolved to protect Casca and not leave her ever again. This proved to be a difficult task, because now he had to deal with at least twice the number of spirits and with a very apparent handicap on his side. As such, when he was exhausted, he was running on empty, and he would pass out like Drake on a flight. This was not the best thing to do when Puck was your lookout, because Casca just undid her bonds and ran away. That is when she was set upon by a gang of thugs who nearly took advantage of her in her vulnerable state. We thought we were about to be shown yet another harrowing incident play out in front of our eyes, but instead, what happened was somehow worse. Casca managed to kill her attackers out of pure instinct, getting blood all over herself, and when Guts saw her, he immediately thought she had returned to her former self. The Black Swordsman's pent-up desire and frustration was released in perhaps the blackest act of his soul as he assaulted Casca and nearly tore her bosom off with his bare teeth. Though Guts didn't stoop as low as Griffith, he was nearly compelled to by his Beast of Darkness, and it was this event that caused him to rely on his party in the first place. But all this happened when he didn't even have the Berserker armor with him. All he had was a location in his mind where he could keep Casca safe. When Guts learned that the same location, Elfhelm, was also a place where he could possibly get Casca's mind restored, he made it his life's mission to get there, no matter what happens. He must have thought that this was his only chance of redeeming himself and the only way to get back the woman he loved. But the Skull Knight warned him after telling him about the Flower Storm Monarch that there was no guarantee his wish would be Casca's, and Guts had to find that out the way he finds out everything else in his life, the hard way. A mind regained and then immediately lost. How Casca figures into the endgame of Berserk. Well, there is a lot that we have not touched on regarding Casca's life in her regressed state. As we said earlier, we could make an entire video about Elaine. The major plot developments considering Casca's mental health would not take place until the Black Swordsman party arrived on Elfhelm. The entire basis for Guts' journey following the incarnation ceremony had been this, getting Casca back to her normal self. So we can only imagine how he felt when he realized that even after getting her fixed, he still couldn't see her without giving her waves of PTSD. In chapter 347, Shirke, Farnese, and Casca are led by the Flower Storm Monarch Danon into a chamber called the Corridor of Dreams, where the ritual to heal Casca's mind was to be performed. Once Shirke and Farnese had overcome their own subconscious hurdles, they made their way into Casca's dreamscape, which at first was composed entirely of childish drawings. But once they cracked open her actual inner psyche, the master disciple arrived into a dimly lit wasteland dotted by spiked trees and a black sun. In this wasteland, a black dog with a single eye and a stump for a leg was dragging around a coffin. This was the representation of Guts and Casca respectively within the latter's regressed mind. Inside the coffin was a fragmented doll that represented Casca herself, and a tiny bean-sized Elaine who represented her current mental state. Farnese and Shirke realized that in order to restore Casca to her former self, they were going to have to collect the fragments of her past life and put them back into the coffin to make her whole again. Their journey through the wasteland lasts for an abstract amount of time, where they fight hordes upon hordes of monsters that look similar to apostles from the Eclipse, before they finally arrive at the core of Casca's fractured mind. Here, they find a sight that is interesting to say the very least. The final piece of Casca's mind appears to be a heart covered in thorns. Shirke explains that this is a hex, which means that Casca's mind would not be restored completely free of consequences. But before this object is retrieved, it takes on the appearance of the demon child. As Farnace and Shirke do their best to free the heart from the vines holding it prisoner, they are constantly attacked by a falcon that represents Griffith. The only reason they stay alive is because Houndguts synced with the berserker armor Farnace brought from her dream, otherwise they'd have been toast. Once the final fragment was restored to Casca's coffin, Minnie Elaine spoke to Farnace for the first time. She said that she wanted to see someone, and Farnace, not knowing she was hexed, promised to make it happen. Yet when Casca met Guts after having her mind restored, she fell prey to an intense bout of PTSD. Before that, she had been fine. She thanked the entire Black Swordsman party for taking care of her, and gave special praise to Farnace. She took out a few Viking golems with ease, and even gave Isidro a sword fighting lesson, remarking that she seemed to be fated to be the big sis of every group. Shirke noted that the original Casca's ode was entirely different to the person she had known so far, and yet when Casca saw Guts, she immediately equated him with the eclipse and fell unconscious. It happened again when she tried to talk to him, and ended up recalling Judo's death when commenting on the similarities between him and Isidro. It took Farnace holding her hand while she slept for her to get a modicum of peace after that. And then Griffith attacked Elfhelm, and this is where we finally talk about the Moonlight Boy. This mysterious child had been appearing in front of Guts' party following Griffith's incarnation into the physical world on the night of a full moon, and Casca seemed to have an instinctual bond with him. We now know that's because the Moonlight Boy is the demon child's essence taking over Griffith's vessel of flesh to go back to its parents on full moons. We know this to be true because every time the demon child appeared in front of Guts or Casca, it was during the full moon. This is why Griffith was able to execute a stealth attack on Elfhelm, one of his major targets. But more than that, he finally got his hands on Casca again. When Griffith saw Guts at the Hill of Swords, his body instinctively moved to protect Casca because she was in harm's way. Having deduced that this was because of the demon child, the Falcon of Darkness now intended to control his transformations by taking Casca hostage. Currently, the branded girl is present in Falconia, a city populated by humans and apostles, who are attracted to the scent of the brand. Though Griffith is their master, there's no telling how they'll react this close to a sacrifice, no matter how important it is to their master. There is already evidence that the apostles grow hungry for human flesh. Casca's presence also complicates things for Sonia and Charlotte, because how in the heck does Griffith expect to explain his way through kidnapping the woman he betrayed and violated all those years ago? And while you try to come up with the answers to these questions, Guts sinks deeper into his despair than he ever has before. Before his untimely passing, Miura-sensei said that the restoration of Casca's mind is the culmination of Guts' current character arc. This tells us that the only way he sees her again is when she's either about to die or on the brink of death, and that's the best case scenario. Chapter 371 ended on perhaps the most tantalizing cliffhanger since Chapter 364, and it's not an exaggeration to say that once again, Casca has become the axis around which the story revolves. Marvelous verdict. And that's it for this video. Bit of a long one, we know, but Casca is the heart and soul of Berserk, and she deserves all the time in the world. Without her, this story would not be where it is today, and it's all thanks to the egos of men. Let us know what you thought of this video down in the comments section below. And if you like anime-based content, do check out our new channel, Marvelous Anime. It's got some great Attack on Titan content on there currently. Oh, and also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Have a good one, be safe out there, and thanks for watching.